Hi ladies, this is your U.S. history lecture for today. It's for September 24th, and we're going to be covering pages 67 through 72. As you can see, we've started a new chapter. We're in chapter 5, and we're going to talk about the growing tension between the colonies and England, and we're going to see how this tension becomes conflict. So, the problem with the colonies in England is that England decides to change her policy towards the American colonies. So originally, England had a laissez faire policy. That means hands off. That basically means that she left them to govern themselves, to protect themselves, and provide for themselves. So they became very independent. However, the policy towards the colonies changed when Great Britain realized that there was a lot of potential in the American colonies. And this potential, of course, was that a lot of money could be made for England, and England could prosper with the use of the colonies' raw goods and different things like that. So the policy changed from laissez-faire to mercantilism. And mercantilism basically is when everything within the colony goes to the mother country for the mother country's good, and the colonies don't really get anything out of that. So what happens is between 1650 and 1696, Parliament passes a series of navigation acts. There were several of them, but the two most important were the Navigation Act of 1660, which provided that all goods imported to or exported from the colonies must be carried on ships owned by British subjects. So this is going to, again, make money for the British. And then the other one was the Navigation Act of 1663, which further restricted colonial trade by requiring that European products headed for the colonies must first be shipped to England and then rechanneled to the colonies. So there's a lot of focusing on making things more complicated for the colonists just so that England can make a little bit more money, which would be frustrating, of course, to people in the colonies who did not have these limitations before, and they're trying to figure out how to deal with it. So another source of tension between England and the colonies was the Molasses Act. So in 1773, Parliament passed the Molasses Act, which taxed molasses, as I'm sure you can guess by the name, but it also taxed sugar, rum as well, sugar and rum as well. And this act was specifically created with British merchants in mind so that they could make more money. Now, the Molasses Act was not seriously enforced by the colonists, but if it had been, it would have really hurt the colonial economy. So what the colonists did was they just smuggled these products that they wanted, the molasses, the rum, and the sugar. They smuggled it into the colonies. So the British aren't going to give up yet with their colonies. They want to try to get as much money out of them as possible. So they start to put more regulations on colonial industry. So they passed several acts. One of them is the Woolens Act, the Hat Act, and the Iron Act. And all three of these acts were designed to limit the profit that colonists would make versus how much money the British government would make. So these acts are designed to prohibit the colonists from making a lot of money, which of course again is going to be frustrating to them. And I have these pictures down here because this is the supposed to represent colonies of England, and a look at mercantilism, the Navigation Acts, and then the Molasses Act. Okay, so not only is there this growing tension between the colonists and Great Britain because Britain's starting to pass all these new laws and taxes, and the American colonists are starting to feel their liberty being slowly taken away from them, but there's also the effects of the French and Indian War, which we have to discuss and recognize that have a huge impact on the colonists as well as on England. So the colonists actually benefit from the French and Indian War. They benefit because they gain valuable experience in self-defense. Remember, George Washington was part of the French and Indian War, and he's going to play a pretty prominent role in the American Revolution. So he's not the only one who was able to gain valuable military skill. A lot of the colonists did. And with the French gone from the North American continent, the colonists were less dependent on the English for protection. So in a sense, they gained even more independence versus England, who only gained problems. And this has to do with the fact that in England, their finances were ruined thanks to the French and Indian War. It left England in heavy debt, which is going to make the English feel like they need to tax the colonists more, because after all, wasn't it that they were defending the colonists, so shouldn't the colonists pay for the war? And then also with the French and Indian War coming to a close and the French having lost, there's going to be more of a threat from Native Americans attacking the British. And this, of course, has to do with the fact that colonists are starting to move westward, and the Indians start to feel like that their homeland is being threatened, and so they start to attack, and they become more hostile towards the colonists. And the Crown has to send thousands of troops, British troops, to protect the colonists from future Indian uprisings. So England has a lot of problems thanks to the French and Indian War. There's other inflammatory circumstances that cause the colonists to become very disenchanted with the British Crown. One of them is writs of assistance. And basically what writs of assistance was that they were issued by the British government to help authorities enforce trade laws in the colonies. So basically, they're like search warrants, and they could go at any time and search virtually anywhere for contraband. And the colonists, remember, because the colonists were guilty of smuggling goods in and not paying the taxes. So the colonists felt like this was a huge violation of their privacy, which is going to later play into America as a nation, because of the fact that somebody has to have a search warrant. They have to have probable cause to search somebody's house. But that wasn't the case for the colonists. But because of these things that were happening, colonists would remember it, and later they would direct their new nation to avoid such outrages from happening. The other inflammatory circumstance was Parson's cause. And basically with Parson's cause, a dispute rose between England and the colonists over England's right to legislate in the colonies. And specifically it played out in the area of Virginians, because by law, Virginians had to pay a tax to support Anglican ministers, and they would actually pay the ministers in tobacco. But unfortunately, there was a tobacco shortage, and the ministers and the colonists had a dispute over how to pay the ministers, because if the ministers had been paid the regular amount of tobacco, they would have been making an excessive salary. So the House of Burgesses ruled that the clergy should be temporarily paid in money. And in 1759, the ministers thought they were being treated unfairly. So in 1759, they appealed to the king and his privy council, who actually overturned what the House of Burgesses had stated about them being paid in money. And then the Anglicans decided to sue for back pay after that. And it caused a huge conflict between England and the colonies, because England was overturning what the colonies had said. And there's a very famous lawyer named Patrick Henry, who you might be, hearing about later, if his name's not familiar to you already, who insisted that the king had no right to arbitrarily set aside colonial rule. And Patrick Henry argued that because of this, there was a breaking of the agreement between his subjects and the king. So speaking of the king, one of the biggest conflicts that is going to lead to the French Revolution, not the French Revolution, excuse me, the American Revolution, is the fact that a new king reaches the throne. And this is George III. He's pictured here. George III is famous for wanting to be a good king, but he ends up causing a whole lot of trouble for his English subjects in America, so much so that they declare a revolution and decide they're no longer English citizens. And one of the reasons that George III was so troublesome to the colonists is that he was trying to exact an authoritarian rule over them when they were not used to that kind of leadership from their king. Because remember, the colonies, before this new trend of mercantilism, the colonies were used to being independent and doing their own thing. There's also a new prime minister who's going to cause some problems, and his name is George Grenville. And George Grenville and George III determined that they're going to bring the colonies into subjection. And Grenville decides that he's going to solve Britain's defense and financial problems regarding North America by introducing a whole lot of taxes on the colonists, which of course the colonists do not like that at all. But some of these acts, or taxes, but they're acts, would be the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Quartering Act. Those are the most famous. And the colonies respond to Grenville's program with great outrage. They say that, particularly with the Sugar Act, that there is no taxation without representation, and that England is violating their rights by making them have taxes. Samuel Adams is pictured in the middle here, and he leads a protest against the Stamp Act, and they decide that there is a need for the people of America